Almost all ecosystems experience disturbance. Here, we'll cover differences among disturbances and how ecosystems respond to disturbance. Disturbance is a major cause of long-term fluctuations in the structure and functioning of ecosystems. And again, almost all ecosystems at one point in time are going to experience disturbance. And it's a major factor that we think about with regards to the structure and functioning of modern ecosystems. And the consequences of disturbance are often long-lasting, and so there's long-term fluctuations in the structure and functioning of ecosystems as a response to disturbance. Now, the authors offer two different definitions of disturbance. The first is that disturbance is a relatively discrete event in time that removes plant biomass. And this was Grimes' definition. I think if you take a look in the book, it's attributed to him. So it's the idea that for a given process, it's relatively discrete and happens in a short amount of time. And if you take a look at biomass, it's going to cause some removal of biomass. So disturbances remove plant biomass. They kill plants. The other definition is a little bit longer. So here, this is the White and Pickett definition from 1985. It says that disturbance is a relatively discrete event in time and space that alters the structure of populations, communities, and ecosystems, and causes changes in resource availability or the physical environment. The definition is longer, but I'm not necessarily sure that it adds much. So before we said that it's a discrete event in time, and they've added space. So apparently adding space in here would say that we're going to rule out those factors that aren't occurring on a global basis all at once, which probably doesn't add too much. And then it alters the structures of populations, communities, and ecosystems. And in this case, adding populations and communities, they're all part of ecosystems, so that doesn't add much. And causes changes in resource availability or the physical environment. So the difference here is that it's going to alter the structure of ecosystems, but be associated with changes in resource availability or the physical environment. So in this case, if we were to take a look at something like nutrient supply, and let me do that again, excuse me. So this is time on the x-axis, and this is nutrient supply on the y. If you had a relatively constant nutrient supply, and then you had a discrete event where there was a pulse in nutrient availability, external to the system, for example, you dumped fertilizer on it. This definition would include that pulse of fertilizer because it causes a change in resource availability. It's a discrete event, and it's going to alter the structure of populations, communities, and ecosystems. So under a classic definition, a pulse of nutrient availability would not necessarily be considered a disturbance. And instead, a disturbance is something that just leads to a decline in biomass and being a relatively discrete event. The former definition is one that I probably associate more with disturbance, and this is probably a little bit too broad. So if you have a big pulse in nutrient availability, even if that causes a change in the structure of populations or communities, I wouldn't necessarily consider that to be a disturbance, but it is a change in resource availability. The authors also state that the dividing line between disturbance and normal function is somewhat arbitrary. And my thought is that it's not necessarily arbitrary, but there's an important point here. That disturbance can vary in a number of factors. And if you think about some of those factors, you can have relatively low levels of disturbance. So this is time on the x-axis, and this is the amount of disturbance or biomass removal on the y-axis. You can have relatively low levels of disturbance that are chronic, that continue to happen. So small amounts of herbivory, for example, that happen constantly over time. In the system might be more or less at steady state. So if you take a look at how much grass is there that's being eaten, that can stay pretty constant over time because your disturbance levels are constant. Because it doesn't necessarily alter the structure and function of an ecosystem, or doesn't lead to an abrupt change, that disturbance is chronic and not always considered to be a disturbance as part of the system. But again, that leads to kind of fuzzy definitions, and I still would say that anytime you remove biomass, that's a disturbance. But it's important to note that disturbances can differ in the severity. So if we think of the time course, you can have small disturbances that don't remove a lot of biomass, or large disturbances that do remove a lot of biomass. And so that's the severity of the disturbance. Now, it's important to contrast disturbance with other things, and another term that's often contrasted with disturbance is stress. And what stress is that a stress is a change in a factor that reduces the net resource acquisition. And that contrasts from a disturbance in that a disturbance removes biomass. So if you were to take a look at what a stress would be, for example, if this is the rate of photosynthesis over time, a stress might lower photosynthetic rates, but not necessarily because leaf biomass was being consumed. So disturbances remove disturbances remove biomass. Stress lowers the rate of resource acquisition or increases the rate of resource loss. Some of the examples that the authors use include tree mortality due to insect outbreaks. And this is a picture of insect outbreaks in some of the Colorado mountains, where you have pine beetles that are killing off large numbers of trees. And you can see that this is definitely a disturbance, that you have individual trees that are dying due to infestations. Now, it's important to note that there's a dividing line between stress and disturbance. And so if this is the level of stress, for example, and this is time, that the level of stress could be constant and it could go up like that. It becomes a disturbance as soon as you have trees that start to die. So even on something like a bark beetle infestation, individual trees can be stressed by individual beetles that are colonizing the tree, and it would just be a stress because it leads to increased resource loss or decreased resource uptake. But it's not a disturbance until biomass is actually being lost, until trees are dying. The impact of a disturbance event depends on three different attributes. First, there's the type of disturbance. So when we think about disturbances, not all disturbances are created equal. And so think about the differences between fires, freezes, and floods. Different ecosystems are going to respond differently to fires than they will freezes or floods. And it depends on the species that we have there. For example, when those disturbances occur. But the first most important thing to think about for disturbance is not to think of disturbance as generic, but understand that different disturbances are going to have different impacts depending on what kind of factor is removing biomass. Secondly, we have ecosystem sensitivity. And again, this is just a general idea that different species differ in their response to disturbance factors. So fire might kill some plants, but not necessarily kill other plants. A cold snap would, again, damage some plants, but not necessarily other plants. And so species differ in how they respond to different environmental factors, and therefore ecosystems composed of different species will respond differently also. And then thirdly, we have disturbance severity. And again, this is just another way of saying it's the magnitude of biomass lost. And there's some disturbances that could be relatively low severity, others that are high. And again, we have to think about the time course of that disturbance. So how discrete it is versus how long biomass removal occurs. But that magnitude of loss of biomass is a third factor to think about. This is the spectrum of disturbance severity associated with major types of disturbance. And there are some disturbances that are low severity, for example, for which species are relatively well adapted to. And herbivory is often one of those, that you can have chronic levels of herbivory, but species still reproduce and grow relatively well. So that's a situation where a system can be maintained at a relatively stable state. So if you want to think about it and what that process is over time, even though there's herbivory, more or less those processes continue at the same rate, even though there's chronic herbivory. Other factors range in the magnitude of their effects. So we can have relatively low severity fires and high severity fires. And same thing with agricultural clearing or flooding. Some floods are relatively benign and don't cause much disturbance, not much loss of biomass. Others are massive and will reset an entire ecosystem. So this is just a designation of variation in disturbance severity that we have, and noting that some disturbances tend to be relatively low severity and they don't necessarily reset an entire system. You don't have herbivory that's so intense that resets it. Whereas in other cases, glaciers and volcanoes tend to occur relatively rarely and are only high severity. When we think about the differences among those, when we talk about severe disturbances, it's not just the removal of biomass that's important, but they can also remove or bury most of the products of past ecosystem processes. So if you were to say start from scratch on an ecosystem with bare rock and watch that change over time, that a relatively low severity disturbance is not going to change things very much, but a high severity disturbance essentially resets that ecosystem and it has to develop all over again.